Let's swing back around to something that we saw while we were diving into how require and module.exports work. Let's look at exports versus module.exports. Remember, when our code is run through Node, it's wrapped in a function expression. And so, for that reason, we have access to this module object. That's a parameter passed to the function. But if you also remember, there was something else, the first parameter, called exports. So, what is that? Well, we saw that when the function is executed, essentially something like this, these 5 parameters passed to my code whenever my code is run, the first parameter is module.exports. That's the value passed to the function that wraps my code. So really, exports, that first parameter, is a shorthand to module.exports. It's 2 variables pointing at the same object in memory. Well, why not just use exports all the time? It's there as a shorthand. And that's true. However, there's a little bit of a problem, and it has to do with a quirk in JavaScript when it comes to objects being passed by reference. Remember that the require function returns module.exports, so it's really returning the property on the module object. And that's a separate variable from that exports variable, the parameter that receives that value. So we have 2 variables pointing at the same memory space, and so in pass by reference, they'll be the same thing. However, exports does not work for all of the patterns that we've seen so far. Let's show what we mean. Let's go ahead back to my app.js file, and we'll do the same thing we did before. I'll make a greet.js file, but instead of using module.exports, I'll use that shorthand parameter that was provided. So just exports by itself. And I'll replace it, because it was an empty object, with a function. Now I want to show you something. I'm going to console.log exports, and then I'm going to console.log the exports property on the module object. Remember that this is what is passed to exports, so at that moment they both point to the same memory location. I changed what exports is. I changed it from an empty object to a function. So what do you expect would happen here? Well, I'll go ahead and require this in my app.js file, just so the require function runs and it causes my code to run. I won't do anything with it. And then we'll go ahead and execute it. You see the result? Exports is now a function, but module.exports is still the empty object. Now you might have expected that when we set exports equal to the function, that module.exports would also change, because they're both pointing at the same location in memory. And if you were in a different programming language, you'd probably be right. But this is a quirk in JavaScript. What's really happening? Well, you might remember what happens when it comes to pass by reference. Initially, module.exports points to this empty object that's set up for us. And when the function expression is invoked, module.exports is passed to the variable just exports. But they still both point to the same location in memory, the same object. That's passed by reference. But there's a quirk in JavaScript when it comes to setting a variable equal to a value. Now, in the case of using that equals, we had module.exports pointing at this object still, but exports was set equal to a value. And in JavaScript, when a variable is set equal to a value, then it's a new spot in memory. In other words, that reference is broken. Module.exports and exports originally pointed to the same spot in memory, to the same object. But now it's broken. So 2 different objects, 2 different spots in memory. And for that reason, exports and module.exports are 2 different things. Now here's the kicker. Here's the problem. What's returned from require? Module.exports. So since I've just broken that reference, exports will not be returned from here because it now points to a different spot in memory than module.exports. But inside the Node.js source code, require returns the module object's property called exports, not this special variable, this parameter that was passed to the function. So that means if I tried to then invoke the function as if I had done it originally because I exported the function, instead of it just working, I get an error. Object is not a function. Why? Because when I go to execute this, what I actually got back was module.exports, that empty object, not the function. So when it comes to exports, I can't override it. I can't use equals. However, I can change it. That is to say, I can add a new property or a new method. So I can change it. I can what's called mutate it. Big word alert. To mutate, that is, to change something. For example, adding a method or a property to an object means you've mutated the object. That's all that really means. So in this case, I used the equals and replaced what the export's empty object was. And that caused it to actually create this function and put it in a different memory location than what module.export points to. But now I'll mutate it. So I'll create a new greet.js, greet2.js. And this case will mutate the object. That is, I'm going to add a method or property. I'm changing the object. And you can mutate other types of things too, but in this case we're mutating the object, and then I'll just console.log those two like we did last time. And to make sure we don't error in this app.js file, I won't try to call that function anymore, and I'll go get my greet2 so that they both run. Then I'll run the program. And notice the first greet where I overwrote what export was, which broke the reference. I have a function for exports and an empty object for module.exports. But in this case, both exports and module.exports are the same object. See, they both have the greet property, the greet method. So, why? Because I simply mutated. I changed the object. I didn't repoint the variable somewhere. And so the reference held still. It still was valid. I can call greet2 dot greet, actually, because I added the method to the object. And then it works at the end there. Hello. So this is great. I can use exports if I want to, but only if I mutate the object. I can't replace the object with something else. So you need to be aware of this if you want to use the shorthand. However, I find this to be really kind of annoying. It doesn't bother me that much to write module.exports because I write it so little. I'm only ever going to use it once inside each module that I build. So it's not a lot of typing. And since this is Node.js JavaScript, unlike when we do JavaScript in the browser, for example, I don't have to worry as much about file size because it's never being downloaded by someone's internet browser. This JavaScript code is sitting on the server. So, since I like to lower my cognitive load while coding, that is, how many things I have to think about at any one time, I don't want to have times when I make a mistake because I forget about this quirk when it comes to exports and module.exports. And since exports is just a shorthand and it does the exact same thing as module.exports, my personal recommendation is just use module.exports. I forget that export exists. I just pretend that it doesn't, so that I never have to think about which one can I use under what circumstance. Now, there's nothing wrong with using exports, and you'll probably see code out there that uses the shorthand, and that's fine, and you can too if you want. But I like to not have to think about it. All right, so that's the difference between exports and module.exports. Again, it's just shorthand, but it does come with that quirk. All right, let's move on.